Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I am your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very, very senior and accomplished professional from the US, Jeanette Bronée. Jeanette, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Jeanette is a well-being culture strategist. She's an author, and all of you know I am very partial to authors. So she's an author of a book titled The Self-Care Mindset, and we'll talk about it. And she's a passionate mental health advocate. So Jeanette, before we get into talking about the self-care mindset, tell me about your own journey, about your father and your two burnouts.
Yes. Where to start? Sometimes I feel like my life started after I burned out, because that's when I woke up to the importance of being mindful about my journey. But I also look back and I realize that the journey is so important. And so I appreciate that you're actually bringing it back there. I grew up in Denmark, and so I grew up in a well-being culture, and yet I burned out. So there's an acknowledgement there of, environment and human, like what's the interaction. And I think growing up in Denmark, I was a competitive gymnast as a child. I was picked for the team at 6. I had, I thought of my life as blessed and exciting. And yet when I look back now as an adult, I see these small, I don't know if you can call them traumas, but, experiences of life. Like I almost died at birth. I almost drowned when I was 5. I was in a car crash where I almost died at 7. So all of a sudden I started seeing these things, and I'm realizing that a lot of my journey has been about change and adversity. And I think the burnouts were partly me having a really high ambition and pushing myself as a really young executive. I was an executive at a very early age. I started out in the fashion business. My background is in marketing and communication. And I love marketing and communication. I still do. And I loved my job. I loved everything about it. And a lot of times when we talk about burnout, it's because we don't feel we have agency over our own lives. But what also happened was that I was just living on coffee and, working 24/7. Sometimes I didn't sleep because that was the era of just working and pushing hard to achieve. It was in the 80s, right? And yes, I'm that old. And so I think it's important that we learn from that journey rather than think of it as, oh, I did this wrong. But I was waking up along the way, right? Yes. And one of the people, as you're mentioning, my dad, he was somebody who always pushed me to be more intentional and more mindful. And I dismissed it because he was my dad. Until later, when he was dying from cancer, maybe I'll back up a moment. He broke his neck in a skiing accident, ended up not being able to work. He had his own business as an executive consultant. And after that accident, a lot of things started to change. The family started, changing. And suddenly both of my parents had cancer at the same time. My mother died suddenly. My father and I then spent a year and a half basically knowing he was dying, but not knowing when. And things really changed around that time. You can think of that time as really difficult, and I do, but I also think of it as really meaningful. And spending time with my dad, talking to him about his journey, my journey, our experiences and our choices really made me realize that we tend to let life lead us and we react to it rather than us pausing a bit more and really, I don't know if I should say chewing on it, but really sort of digesting what it is that's happening and then choosing how to respond to it so that we're more in charge of navigating our own life in the face of adversity and uncertainty and all the things that are the reality of life. And I think that's the real big message for me is waking up to all the realities of life. And my dad being a really important, and my mother for that matter too, she struggled with mental health. And therefore it's part of what I do today is the inspiration from my mother to really understand what mental health is really about. And she taught me it's a lot more about the heart and feeling emotionally connected with ourselves and others. And my dad taught me that we need to learn to listen more. And so those are some of the, fast trajectory of my journey. And
what an amazing journey. And thank you so much for sharing it. I mean, when you were telling me about the 80s, I was thinking to myself, and only this morning I was speaking to someone else and I was telling them, I said that I'm from the boomers generation, and we never had the luxury of to be able to say that I'm taking a 1 month sabbatical or some time off. If I left a job on a Friday evening, Monday morning I was at work in my new job. So thank you for sharing this. Jeanette, now let's talk about your book, The Self-Care Mindset. Tell me about your book and what was your hypothesis when you started to write it?
So let me add a little bit to the journey, which is that after my second burnout, and which happened after my father died, and I was in the fashion business at the time. Excuse me for 1 second. And that it was, that it was that was the 90s, right? And the fashion business is, you want it, and you think of people as, you can use them and throw them out when you're done with them kind of attitude. And I realized I didn't want to do that anymore. I wanted to help people be busy and healthy at the same time. So I left the fashion business and I started a Path for Life, which was supposed to be a well-being center for cancer patients, but it turned into a well-being center for people who just needed to figure out how to survive work and take care of themselves while being busy and achieving. And after coaching people and many leaders, but also just basically everyone from every walks of life, I realized that we all have a similar problem. We think that self-care is our own problem.
Correct.
And I constantly saw that it wasn't. I constantly saw that self-care, our relationship with others, and our relationship with work was interconnected. I constantly saw that in my coaching sessions. I saw it with leaders. I saw it with any creatives. I saw it with professionals in any kind. And so I realized that we have self-care all wrong. And so my work over the past, 18 years has been helping people being able to reclaim self-care in their daily lives.
Okay.
And so the book is about that. And the book is about not just the past 18 years, but the current situation that we're in, which is that at least now, because of COVID, that was the one gift at least we got from COVID, was we realized that humans are a resource to protect and harness. Right? We realize that. We realize that we can't just use people and then, go to the next one, because that doesn't work anymore. And so I think that businesses and organizations have truly woken up to the importance of health and well-being, mental health, and how much sustaining that in our everyday lives, at work, in the workplace, together as a culture, is essential for the success of the company. And so the book is that duality that happens between self, others, and work. Well, duality of others and work happens there too, right? And the impact that self-care has on culture, but also culture has on self-care.
That's it. And how do you define self-care?
What I also constantly saw when I was working with people was that they were struggling so much with habits. And we see a lot of books that are out about creating better habits and so on and so forth. And I agree, without habits, life doesn't change. However, the mindset comes first. That is another thing I consistently saw, that if the way we think about ourselves, about who we are, our worth, our value, what we contribute, if we are in a mindset that we're not enough, that we're not good enough, that we can't handle it, that we don't have the tools, like if the mindset and the thinking that's constantly going on in our mind is focused on basically solving the wrong problem, and if we don't feel that we are successful, if we don't feel we contribute or belong in the workplace, we don't go home and belong and take care of ourselves. And so that nuance of how we feel becomes how we think, and therefore becomes how we act. So the habits actually come last.
Correct.
So a lot of times we think of self-care as habits, but actually I believe self-care is the mindset that we have with us all the time, every single day. Our mindset is either our friend or our enemy.
And you continue on to say that self-care is the key to building a better and healthier culture.
Yeah.
Can you explain this with an example?
Yes, I can. So if your mindset is that you're not good enough, or if your mindset is, I'm not doing it right, if your mindset is, I can't figure this out, I'm a dummy, right? Because we are not very kind to ourselves. Most people would not talk to others the way they talk to themselves is something we often hear, right? And that's very true. So that inner dialogue that we have going on can either be can be the inner critic or the inner coach. So one of the things that happens is that if we're not mindful, so one of the things I talk about a lot in the book is about power pausing. So if we don't pause for that moment and check in, where's my mind at? How am I feeling? And therefore choosing, how do I communicate? How do I show up? How do I solve problems? And also express what it is we need, which comes back to the 4 questions in the book, the self-care mindset. So if we don't pause for that moment and just be like checking in with ourselves, we can show up as that inner critic. We show up as the critic in the team too. So one of the things that often happens is if we're sitting back going, this isn't working, because we're scared, we're afraid, we don't think we got it. Then we're going to be critical in the team. We're going to be critical of our coworkers. We're going to be critical of our employees. And I always say, and this is something I learned from my dad, right? He said, catch people in doing something right. Look for what people are doing right and build on that. But if you're stressed, if you don't know how to pause, if you don't know how to get out of that critical mindset and get into that curious, constructive mindset, your communication with other people is going to be just as critical and not constructive. And so that's the difference there. Like, can we have a more curious culture by being more curious ourselves rather than in that critical, stressed, this is not working kind of mindset all the time?
Fascinating. And, my father, who was a very senior and decorated Army brigadier general, he said exactly the same thing to me when we were young. Look for the positives in everybody. And forget the negatives. That's I think exactly what your father said. Because that comes with age and wisdom.
It does, right?
But moving on, Jeanette, you also talk about the 3 key tools in the self-care mindset.
Yes.
What are these 3 tools?
Yes. So that was what I was alluding to before, right? The power pause. I think the biggest tool that and the easiest tool, I should say the most simple tool, but not easy tool, is to pause more, right? And a lot of times when I talk about pausing, I don't just talk about taking a break. It's very important that a pause can be that pause that is me listening to you instead of me being in my mind wondering what you're going to say next. I'm just listening to you instead and answering and pausing before I answer because I want to think about it. And most cultures are not allowing that pause.
Correct.
Most cultures are like, you got to have the answer. And so we're thinking about the answer without listening. And so the pause is not just about, I need 5 minutes before the next meeting. It's also that. It's also changing this idea that we have to go meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting instead of being able to just step back for a moment, air out our brain, sort of allow our nervous system to calm down so that we're not bringing the previous meeting into the next meeting, meaning our thoughts are still over there.
Right.
and we're still thinking about that other meeting, we're actually not being present because we didn't have that 5-minute pause in between. And also we need the physical pause. We need to stretch a little bit. We need to get more water, fill up our tea, go to the bathroom, those little things.
Yeah.
That's part of the pause, that power pause that allows us to regenerate our energy, attention, and focus. But it also is that, so there's the physical pause. There's the emotional pause, like, how am I feeling in there right now? Am I feeling stressed? Am I feeling critical? Am I feeling anxious about something? And then asking the question, what do I need so that I can? And that is then becomes that mental pause where we can then be more focused, have attention, allowing ourselves to lean back for a moment before we lean back in. And so I talk about those 3 stages of power pausing, as I call it. So that's the first tool.
Okay.
Is the power pause. And I think that's the pause that allows us to think better, which is the first section of the book, is how do we think better? The next section is how do we engage better? And there's 4 questions in that. Because a lot of times we're asking the wrong question. We're asking why is something not working?
Yeah.
And then the mind will answer that question and you get lost. Right? We can acknowledge it's not working. And so that 4 questions helps us become present again. So those 4 questions are based on the how do we change the inner critic to the inner coach? How do we become more aware of how we're feeling? How do we take responsibility for our actions and our response? And how do we ask for what we need? So that's the care, C-A-R-E, in the care mindset, right? That's how we engage better with ourselves. But we can also use those 4 questions to ask better questions of each other. So, I'm not saying we should sit there and be like, so how are you feeling in there? But really realizing that we humans, to be whole humans, are having both a mental and emotional and a physical experience. And understanding that that is there with us all the time is how we can start creating better work environments, but also work better with ourselves so that we can show up better. And then the last tool is the AAA, which is what I call the synthesized version, the shortcut of everything I teach in the book and the 2 tools. So we pause. We sort of check in on the 4 questions, just fast. Like once we practice that, we can do that really fast. It's not like we have to sit and journal. But then we can use AAA to acknowledge how we feel, which is that power pause and 4 questions. And accept the circumstances for what it is. That's the second A. Accept the circumstances. Because a lot of times we get lost in discussing why something's not working.
Right.
Right? And we waste so much time. How many meetings have you been in where by the end of the meeting, you're like, okay, so what do we do about it? Right? Because we've talked about what happened, why did it go wrong? And sometimes that's important. Sometimes it's very important to know what happened and what went wrong, but we have to learn from it, not fix it because we can't. It's in the past.
Correct.
And then we can ask, what do I need so that I can solve the right problem, which is how do we move forward? And so I call AAA how to get unstuck fast and make more, faster decisions and solve the right problem, to be honest.
Very interesting. You also, when you spoke of care, when I was reading about you and your book, care is curiosity, acknowledgement, respect, and empathy.
Yes.
Talk to us briefly about this as well.
Yes. So the 4 questions are based on self-communication, self-awareness, self-responsibility, and self-expression. When we go through that, we show up. The result of that process that creates a more self-caring and therefore care-driven environment. So that's how self-care becomes a care-driven environment. Care-driven leadership is we show up with that curiosity. We acknowledge people, how they feel. The awareness allows us to acknowledge how somebody feels, respect them for what they need and how that can be incorporated in such a way that we support people in achieving their goals. Because we all know that the leader who just is asking you why something not done is not getting the result they need.
Correct.
The leader who's asking, what do you need so that you can get done, is creating the solution with their team, right? And so that is then the empathy of understanding what does somebody need and support them in getting there. And that's, I think, is where leadership and care-driven leadership is at today, is what I call care-driven leadership, and what I think will be the future of culture and leadership is that it needs to be more care-driven. It needs to be more connected, and not just focusing on get to the goal, but how do we get to the goal? What is the way we support people in getting there by allowing people to have a self-care mindset that allows them to ask for what they need. And now we're actually building a culture where people are co-creating their work environment in a way that gives them responsibility, but also agency. And that is back to the burnout, is that we actually burn out when we have lost agency over our own lives.
Very interesting.
It's not just for working too much. We burn out from worrying too much and feeling that we don't matter, feeling that we don't have agency.
Very interesting. So, Jeanette, I've got time for two more questions. My next question is that you believe that work-life balance is no longer relevant in the new world.
Yes.
Please explain this.
I'm almost arguing that it never was, because I think that is that separation we have between work and human, and that is artificial. So there's a lot of conversation about bringing our whole selves to work, and sure, we're not going to bring the whole self that, is laying on the couch at night watching TV. That is not the whole self we're talking about. We're talking about the self-care mindset, whole self, right? And so if we can create more quality in our relationships at work, if we can allow the understanding of what do human beings need to regenerate their energy, their attention and focus throughout the day, then we're not so wasted at night that we will crash on the couch. We actually can do something at night, like be with friends, be with family, do sports, whatever it is we want to do. So right now we're wearing ourselves out all day long, and we think we have to recover when we have time off. But we actually need to look at the workplace as a regenerative environment where we're supporting our energy, physical, emotional, and mental energy throughout the day. Because not only does it optimize how we work throughout the day, and therefore doesn't create that mental fatigue that many people have at the end of the day, where they might as well stop working, but they keep doing it because they haven't finished. And so we actually work better all day long. So we create more work quality, which then becomes life quality as well. And so we no longer think of how we support the humans that we are as time off. Of course, we need time off. But we don't stop worrying about work just because we're home.
Well said. Great response.
And so that is where we need to understand what happens at work doesn't stay at work, because that's not what that's not what a whole human, that's not how we're created. We don't stop worrying just because we're not there. And that's the work-life quality that we need to learn how to solve the problems to have better relationships in the workplace, more work quality, work-life quality.
Very interesting. And my last question, and I'm going to come back to your father, because you said that your father opened your eyes to the power of using your feelings as information to cultivate connection and communicate in a way that allowed you to understand yourself and others better.
Yes.
I know you spoke about the positive part of it, but help me understand this lesson of wisdom you got from him.
Yeah. I think a lot of that was part of, the process when he was dying. I learned to understand some of the things that he's been teaching me all my entire life. But when I was a little girl, I would listen to him talk to executives and CEOs and, directors of boards and things like that about their lives, them as their human beings, not just their professional lives. And my dad would always think of it as being a whole human, especially as a leader. He actually believed that a leader needs to be a whole human to actually be an effective leader. And so later on, I understood, and now I understand more what he meant. But he always taught me to listen to the words that are not being said. He taught me to listen with the heart, not just with the ears. He wanted me to listen to understand the human being behind. And you can only do that by listening to your own emotions too. and listening to the conversation, listening to what it is that's happening. And I think when he was dying, he received a lot of letters from people that thanked him for the conversation they had. Sometimes conversations he didn't even remember, because they felt seen and heard in those conversations. And they felt understood. They felt that they had that they could be, and they could express what their hopes and dreams were, not just their goals. And I think, though, that's what's starting to happen too in our culture now, right? Is that we're realizing that to keep the motivation and the engagement, we need to actually be more in touch with how we feel. And the other thing too about that is that if we are not mindful of how we feel, we will react. We will react based on the ego. We will react based on protecting ourselves. We will be defending. And he always said, if we can't be open about who we are, which is part of our emotional selves, if we can't be open about that, there's a good chance that we're not fully authentic. And that is, so interestingly, so much of the conversation right now in the workplace is, how do we become authentic? What does that actually mean? And what it actually means is to listen to our emotions and use them as information so that we can communicate more in more intentional, more curious, more constructive way, rather than just lashing out and behave with, the defense mechanisms and the aggression that right now sometimes is what authentic means to some people, and it's not. Authentic means that you're actually honest with your own emotions and using them to communicate what it is you need so that you can achieve the goals you're trying to achieve.
How amazing. Jeanette, on that note, thank you so much for speaking to me. As you've been speaking about your father, it took me back to my own. I had a very, very close relationship with my father.
Yeah.
And I actually was thinking that maybe it's time for me to write a book, Lessons from a Father, on all my learnings, because, as you were speaking, I could almost empathize with a lot of the comments that you were making.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for speaking to me about your book, your book, The Self-Care Mindset. And I'm going to ask all our viewers and listeners to check out Jeanette's book on Amazon and whichever other platform you would go to for your books. Thank you for talking to me about work culture, about the self-care mindset, about care, about your AAA tool, about your three key tools. It's been such an amazing conversation for me. Thank you very much, and good luck to you.
Thank you so much, and may the pause be with you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website, www.tbcy.in, to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for The Brand Called You.